Thanks everyone for joining us today and welcome to today's webinar. My name's James Petty. I'm a project officer at the Victorian Alcohol and Drug Association, VADA, and VADA is the peak body representing publicly funded AOD services in Victoria. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners on the varied lands on which we meet, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation for me, and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. I also acknowledge the ongoing harms of colonisation and further acknowledge the enduring strength and resilience of Australia's First Nations people. Sovereignty was never ceded and this land always was and always will be Aboriginal land. This webinar is part of the TriPeaks project, which is a collaboration between VADA, the Victorian Healthcare Association and the Centre for Excellence in Child and Family Welfare. And today's webinar looks at gaming dependence or addiction, depending on the terminology, and follows on from one we held in August, where Professor Sarah Kelly gave us an overview of the gaming and esports landscape and industry. I'll post a link to the recording of the previous webinar in the chat for anyone who hasn't seen that yet and wants to watch that later. So today we have three excellent presenters who have very kindly agreed to participate in today's webinar. I'm not going to list all their professional achievements now, but trust me, there are plenty of them. We have Mark Griffiths, who is a professor of psychology and director of the International Gaming Research Unit at Nottingham Trent University, nearly said Manchester for some reason. We also have Antonio Verdeo Garcia, who is a professor at the School of Psychological Sciences and the Turner Institute for Brain and Mental Health at Monash University. And we have Mandy Buchholz, who is who's the program lead on a pilot aimed at preventing and reducing harms relating to gaming and gaming dependence among young people in Albury in New South Wales. So I'm going to hurry up and start because Mark is joining us from the UK and it's very, very late there. So just a couple of items of housekeeping. Please use the Q&A function for questions. We'll also monitor the chat, but if you want a question answered, please post it in the Q&A. The webinar is being recorded and will be available on the TriPeaks website. Some of the slide packs from today will be available, but not all of them. There will be question and answer session after the presentations, but Mark won't be joining us for that because it's so late for him. So over to you, Mark. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Okay, thank you very much, James. I hope you're going to be able to. All right, can you see my slides?
Yep.
Okay. Sorry, I'm just getting rid of all your faces on my screen. Okay, everybody, I've got about 20 minutes to kind of encapsulate 35 years of research that I've been working in this area. I've been publishing in the area of video game addiction for over 30 years now, and today I'm going to briefly look at gaming disorder and gaming addiction and try and give you a very brief overview of where I come from, because where I come from is not necessarily going to be where other people come from. I don't know why I'm not going to be able to. Oops. I couldn't find my slide. I just want to start off with a quote. This is from the general kind of drug addiction literature, and it says that certain individuals use certain substances in certain ways thought at certain times to be unacceptable by certain other individuals for reasons both certain and uncertain. And to me, you could take out the word substances there and put in the word gaming or gambling or whatever you want to look at. And really what this kind of quote encapsulates is that the whole area of addiction is a really complex area. Now, for me, having been in this area for 35 years now, the key questions for me, well, the first one is kind of what is addiction, because I'm sure everybody in this webinar is going to have a slightly different definition of what it is to be addicted to something. The second question in relation to today's webinar is, well, does gaming addiction actually exist? And the third question, well, if gaming addiction actually exists, well, what are people actually addicted to? Now, for me, I always tell my students, you've got to have an operational definition if you're working in a particular area. And back in 1988, Gordon Marlett and his colleagues, they came up with a definition that said addictive behavior is a repetitive habit pattern that increases the risk of disease and or associated personal and social problems. It's often experienced subjectively as a loss of control, and these habit patterns are typically characterized by immediate gratification, i.e. the short-term reward, often coupled with delayed deleterious effects, i.e. the long-term costs, and attempts to actually change that an addictive behavior, either via treatment or self-initiation, are typically marked by high relapse rates. Now, the reason I like this particular definition, there's no mention of the word drug there. There's nothing about the ingestion of a psychoactive substance. It really doesn't matter what the behavior is in this particular case. Now, back in 1995, I coined a term, I coined a term called technological addictions, which has now kind of mushroomed over the last 25 years or so. And in that paper back in 1995, I basically operationally defined technological addictions as non-chemical behavioral addictions that involve excessive human-machine interaction. And very importantly, they contain what I call inducing and reinforcing features that contribute to the promotion of addictive tendencies. And these are on top of a person's own kind of biological or psychological predispositions. What I'm talking about are things either in the environment or in actually the way that, for instance, you design a video game or design a slot machine. And for me, they have to include what I consider to be the core components of addiction. Now, anybody that's followed my career, and I've worked on lots of different behavioral addictions, not just in gaming, but when I use the word addiction, I'm using it in exactly the same context of whether I'm talking about exercise addiction or gaming addiction or sex addiction or drug addictions or gambling addiction. And for me, any behavior to be called an addiction for me has to have what I consider to be these 6 core components. And these are salience, mood modification, tolerance, withdrawal, conflict, and relapse. And if I apply that to gaming, what that would actually mean is when I talk about salience is that gaming is the single most important thing in this person's life, and they do it to the neglect of anything else in their life. They use games as a way of modifying their mood, either to get buzzed up, high, aroused, excited, or in fact to do the exact opposite, to tranquilize, to numb, to escape, to de-stress or relax. They build up tolerance over time, needing more, basically having to spend more and more hours engaged in gaming to get those initial mood modifying experiences. Then if a person's unable to actually game, if you're genuinely addicted to gaming, even if you give up for a very short amount of time, you will have noticeable withdrawal symptoms, both on a psychological level, including increased irritability, increased frustration, anxiety, etc., but also physiological withdrawal symptoms, things like nausea, hand sweats, anxiety attacks, etc. But probably the most important component of my model is the 5th one here, conflict. Because what I'm talking about here is that the gaming becomes so important that it conflicts with a person's interpersonal relationships, your partner, your children, your friends. It conflicts with your hobbies and your job or your schoolwork, university work, whatever age you are. And then finally, we've got relapse. So this idea that if you are genuinely addicted to something and you have managed to give up for 2 days or 2 weeks or 2 months or even 2 years, is that when you engage in the activity again, you tend to go straight back into the cycles you're in before. And so for me, I don't class anything as a genuine addiction unless all of these 6 components are there. So if somebody has got maybe 3 or 4 of these, I would probably term that person a problematic user rather than somebody who's addicted. Now, before I talk about some of the research that's been done in this area, one of the things I just want to mention is what I consider to be some of the generic factors that I think facilitate online addictions and particularly online gaming. And these are things that are basically external to the person. So I'm not talking about these biological or psychological or emotional predispositions. I'm talking about things that are external to the person. So for instance, there has been something in the literature called the AAA model, which relates to access, affordability, and anonymity, basically saying that one of the reasons that people get hooked onto online activities is because there's very easy access. It's now become very affordable on the internet, and the internet itself is perceived by the people who engage on the internet as a very anonymous environment, even though the internet is probably the most unanonymous environment there is in the fact that, any company can track exactly what you're doing online. The point is that people feel that it's very anonymous. There is also another model out there called the ACE model, which says that online addictions, including gaming, are triggered by anonymity, convenience, and escape. And again, you can apply these to things like online gaming, online gambling, and lots of other types of potential online addiction. We've also got things like the disinhibition, that we know when they're online, is they lower their emotional guard, is they become far more disinhibited than they would in a kind of face-to-face situation. And of course, now what we've got, when I started researching in the area of internet addiction 25 years ago, things like, meeting people online dating would have been totally alien at the time. But of course, now we do everything online and everything has become very socially acceptable. Now, it wasn't until 2013 that the American Psychiatric Association first formally recognized in the appendix of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders that gaming disorder could actually be classed as a formal behavioral addiction. Now, irrespective of the model or your definitions of what excessive gaming might be or problematic gaming might be, it's very clear that the IGD criteria and the DSM-5 are very similar to the 6 components I've just outlined in terms of my own kind of philosophy on addiction. And if we quickly look at the 9 criteria that are in the DSM-5 for internet gaming disorder, at the moment, you only have to endorse 5 out of those 9 to be classed as somebody who's got gaming disorder. But I take the view that this is on a continuum, and addiction really is at the far end. And you could have some people that would be diagnosed by these criteria of having gaming disorder without necessarily being addicted by my own criteria. But in terms of what we know about IGD, is that the criteria that are out there at the moment is that you have to have a preoccupation with internet games. That would be map onto my idea of salience. Withdrawal symptoms when internet gaming is taken away, and obviously that maps directly onto withdrawal. The need to spend increasing amounts of time engaged in internet gaming, so that would be tolerance. Unsuccessful efforts to kind of stop or control participation in internet gaming, so that would be both relapse and loss of control. A loss of interest in everything else outside in terms of hobbies, entertainment, etc. So that would be a clear example of conflict. Continuing to use, the internet games excessively, despite the fact you might have psychosocial problems attached to that. Again, that is conflict. Deceiving family members or therapists or others regarding the amount of time that you're spending on gambling. Again, that's an example of conflict. Using internet gaming as a way of escaping or relieving a negative mood state. So that's mood modification. Then finally, we've got another example of conflict, which I think is the most important one, is loss of significant relationships, jobs, or educational career opportunities because of participation in internet games. And then for me, I think the real, in terms of what's validated my own kind of 35 years of research, is that I was on the World Health Organization Working Party that actually was part of the, part of a group that actually got gaming disorder recognized formally by the World Health Organization in the ICD-11. So that's the International Classification of Diseases. Although if you look at the criteria for gaming disorder, it's a lot simpler than what we find in the DSM-5. So the World Health Organization just simply say that gaming disorder is defined as a pattern of gaming behavior characterized by impaired control over gaming, increasing priority given to gaming over other activities to the extent that gaming takes precedence over other interests and daily activities, and a continuation or escalation of gaming despite the occurrence of negative consequences. So that's kind of short, sweet, and really, what we're talking about there is that this activity is so all-encompassing that it clinically impairs everything else in a person's life. And that decision to include gaming disorder in the ICD-11, I think kind of validates, those of us that have been working for years and years and years in this area. And, the reason why the World Health Organization did actually accept this is that, the inclusion of gaming disorder comes from a whole consensus of experts. There were about 60 of us on this particular working party. And, what we kind of did is try to, look at all the research that's been done all around the world. And now what we have got, of course, are large-scale epidemiological studies done on, big nationally representative samples, as well as the kind of more biologically based research, looking at, using things like functional magnetic resonance imaging to look at what happens to the brain when people are actually playing video games. Now, in terms of what we know about video gaming, I mean, there's well over 200 empirical studies now that have looked at problematic online gaming. One of the real problems we've got is that, you know, many different people use many different terms, and even I've used different terms in different papers depending on what reviewers have asked for. So, you know, we have phrases like, we have terms like problematic video game playing, problematic online game use, video game addiction, online gaming addiction. Obviously, there's a lot of crossover between all these terms that are used, but at the end of the day, most people are using these terms based on particular screening instruments that are used to assess problematic gaming in the first place. In terms of how big the problem is, well, again, it depends on which particular screen you're using. We did a review recently looking at those, what I would call the highest quality studies, using large-scale epidemiological samples with representative samples. We had the range between about 1.2% and 5.5%. Supposedly having either gaming disorder or internet gaming disorder. There have been two recent meta-analyses that have been done. The first one was done on adolescents. This looked at 16 studies that purely looked at those below the age of 18. What that review found was that the prevalence rate of internet gaming disorder amongst adolescents was just below 5%. And what it also showed is that it was a disproportionate amount of male adolescents compared to female adolescents that had internet gaming disorder. So 6.8% of males versus 1.3% of females. A really good meta-analysis has been done from this part of the world, actually, by Stevens et al., published recently in the Australian and New Zealand Journal of Psychiatry. And they looked at 53 high quality studies that had been published between 2009 and 2019. Combined sample size here of nearly 250,000 participants over 17 different countries. Their first initial finding was that the prevalence of gaming disorder worldwide, well, not worldwide, but based on these 17 countries, was just over 3%. But that prevalence of gaming disorder came down when you only included those really high quality studies that had really stringent sampling criteria, particularly those that were done, nationally with representative studies. And again, what this particular study found, there was a greater proportion of males to females having gaming disorder. Here, it was 2.5 to 1. In terms of other work that's been done, I've only got a couple of slides left now. I personally have co-authored 3 recent gaming disorder reviews where we've looked at particular facets that are associated with gaming disorder. The first one was looking at the role of escapism in gaming. I think most people who work in the behavioral addiction field will tell you that a lot of addictions are about escaping using, whatever behavioral substance whatever substance or behavior as a kind of coping strategy. So one of these reviews, we looked at 26 studies that looked at escapism and avoidance as a coping strategy. And what we found was that, study after study after study did find that escapism and this avoidance coping strategy was very, very prevalent in the research that had been done. 2 more studies that I've done recently with one of my PhD students. In one of them, we looked at the relationship between gaming disorder and personality characteristics. And the one thing that comes through again and again and again in terms of the studies that have been done is that gaming disorder has a very high association with low conscientiousness and a very high association with neuroticism. And that is something you find in other more traditional addictions as well. And then we also looked at the role of impulsivity in gaming as well. And we looked at 33 studies, and in fact, 32 of those studies reported a very positive association between impulsivity and gaming disorder. And the last thing I'll say before I just conclude, one of the things that's really kind of annoying in this area, but kind of exciting at the same time, is that there are many, many different kind of screening instruments out there that try to assess the risk of people developing a gaming disorder or a gaming addiction. Daniel King and his colleagues, and Daniel's based here, he's actually in Adelaide here in Australia, and somebody I've co-published with many times over the last decade or so. But in this particular review that was published at the end of last year, is they looked at all the screening instruments that were out there. And at that particular point, there were already 32 screening tools that had been employed in over 320 studies looking at various aspects of problematic gaming. Here, there was a sample size of just under 500,000 people. What they found was that there was no particular tool out of these 32 tools that was clearly superior, but there were actually 4 scales that they did say out of these 32 that seemed to be better than all the rest. There was what was called the gaming addiction scale, a 7-item gaming addiction scale, a 10-item internet gaming disorder test, a 9-item internet gaming disorder scale short form, and also another 9-item internet gaming disorder scale. And these basically had much better psychometric properties than all the other screens. And basically, I could go at length talking about the fact that, there is basically positives and negatives with all of these particular screens. There is no perfect screen, but it's one of the reasons we have so many different kind of prevalence rates out there, is because there are so many different screens being used. And what I'll just end by saying today, well, based on my 30 years plus publishing in the gaming addiction field, is that I do believe gaming addictions appear to exist, but it depends on the addiction criteria that you use. I think a very important thing to say is that although we know there's a great correlation between the amount of time that people spend on video games and gaming disorder and gaming addiction, the actual amount of time that people spend in and of itself is actually not a very good predictor of necessarily problems, because there's lots of people who can play very excessively with little or no problems in their life at all. I think it's also the case that research shows that the medium of being online may be more harmful for some types of individuals, particularly youth. And most research suggests that when it comes to online addictions more generally, is that when we talk about things like online gaming addiction, online gambling addiction, online shopping addiction, these people are not addicted to the internet. They're addicted to activities on the internet, and that can include gaming. And the final thing I would say is that, from my perspective, it does appear that a small minority gaming can be genuinely addictive, and I'm using the word addiction there in the same way that we use it for more traditional drugs and alcohol. So I'll say thank you very much, and I'm sorry that was a bit of a whiz-bang tour through my career.
Thank you, Mark. That was amazing. It was definitely a chef's tour through the world of gaming and internet, research into gaming and internet addiction. One, just because you were so efficient, you finished slightly early, so I might just ask 2 questions that I had.
Yeah,
one
sure.
was that one of the studies you said a low conscientiousness correlated with IGD. Could you just explain a little more about what low conscientiousness is?
Yeah, well, obviously, if you're very conscientious, you're studious, you're more focused. Basically, in lots of addictions, low conscientiousness we basically, if you're a drug addict, an alcoholic, gambling addict, and gaming addict, you tend to have a much low, in terms of personality trait, much lower conscientiousness. If you're high on conscientiousness, you basically don't tend to have addiction. So I mean, it's very much related to, I suppose, I was going to say intelligence, but that's not strictly true, but it is the kind of more focused, and and I'd say that I'm very highly conscientious, and that's I suppose a lot of academics are. Having said that, lots of my colleagues are very excessive video game players. So but what I'm saying there, and that's another reason why we shouldn't get the amount of time confused with problematic, because my ex-head of department used to play 6 hours every day, and huge mega, I've published a lot with him in this area, and he would play mega hours at the weekend, but he had no partner and no children. So after work, it was easy for him to play 5 or 6 hours a day, and as I say, play 20 hours at the weekend, no trouble whatsoever. And this is why a lot of my papers have said we should not confuse excessive gaming with problematic gaming.
Yeah, that's really interesting, because that was and leads into one of the other questions, or the other kind of question or point I had, in that it reminded me of a kind of more traditional AOD issue of the kind of, the myth of any use as addiction. And so in particular with highly stigmatized drugs, say methamphetamine or heroin, there's a belief that no one could use that substance unproblematically. Like it's impossible. If you use it once, or if you use it all, you are addicted. Video gaming is obviously not going to be like that because it's kind of a much more acceptable part of our life or
But
part
can
of
I
the
just
world.
say, James, just to say, I mean, I have to say, I know people, you know, and I have known people who have been recreational heroin users, cocaine users, without any, you know, addiction problems whatsoever. And I'm not here condoning drug use. I'm just saying that it is actually possible to engage in recreational drug use without it necessarily being addictive, as is the case with gambling, gaming, and lots of other potentially addictive behaviors.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. And I just think it's such an interesting area that I probably gets a bit muddied with, you know, stigma and judgments and stuff as well. Anyway, thank you so much for joining us, Mark, and sacrificing your good night's sleep for us. It's just been really, really valuable. And
yeah, and I'm really sorry that I can't join you for the whole presentation. But good luck to everybody else, and I promise I will watch the rest of the webinar when it's online.
All right, thanks so much, Mark.
Okay, bye everybody.
Bye. All right, that was great. Okay, we'll move on to Antonio. As I said, Antonio is a professor of psychology at the School of Brain and Mental Health. Yeah, it's just gone. Where is it? School of Psychological Sciences and the Turner Institute for Brain and Mental Health at Monash University.
Sorry, James, I wanted to give you a hand, but I didn't know if I was muted or not. Sorry about that.
No worries.
Hello, everybody. Let's see if I can share the screen. All right. Okay, so everybody can see the slides now? Wonderful. Thank you very much, James, for inviting me and for taking the initiative of organizing these webinars. It's a really fascinating topic. So I'm going to be talking about technology-related addictions. So I thought that probably it would be beneficial to start by summarizing what we've learned about so-called traditional addictions, so substance use disorders and gaming disorder from a neurobiological perspective. And so let's say that the consensus at this stage is that substance use and behavioral addictive disorders impact at least 4 different systems in the brain, and obviously the relationship between those brain systems and behavioral systems. So you can see the behavioral systems on the right hand of the slide, and you can see the brain systems represented on the brain on the left. So the first of that systems is what we call the incentive salience system, and is represented in the brain by structures that are deep in the brain, like in the striatum and the insula. And what happens in addictions is that this system becomes highly sensitized to everything that has to do with the substance or the addictive activity. And at the same time, it undervalues everything else. So all the other natural reinforcers, and that could be the basic ones like food or sex, or could be more complex ones like money or social relationships, friendships, etc. Then we have a second system, which is what we call the negative emotionality one, that is represented in the brain by structures of the limbic system. And what happens here, maybe 2 different things. Like one is that the system becomes quite sensitive as well and exacerbated to negative emotions and stress. And that is the typical presentation that you would see in a lot of the people that seek treatment for substance use or gambling disorder. But another aspect of this system is that it kind of like loses ability to regulate emotions in an adaptive way. And that means that sometimes people with addictive problems are going to be hyper-reactive to things that don't seem to be a big deal. And at the same time, they can look flattened or blunted to things that can be perceived as quite important or quite traumatic by other people in their surroundings, in their environment. And then we have a third system, which is what psychologists call the executive function system, which has to do with goals and how we have to regulate our behavior according to our goals. So that goal can be saving for a vacation, can be saving for your retirement, or in the case of people with substance use disorders, it can be to reconnect with friends or to maintain abstinence or reduce substance use. And what we know is that in addiction, there is a difficulty to regulate behavior and to align behavior with those goals in a way that it compromises the ability to achieve those midterm, long-term goals. And then we have a fourth system that is the decision-making system, which is probably best represented by the interaction between the other systems that I've been talking about. And the reason is that every time that we have to make a decision and we are facing like different courses of action or different options, what we do is we retrieve information from all the other systems that I was mentioning. So we retrieve information from the incentive salient system to tell us how important or how valuable each of the options is for us. We retrieve information from the emotional system and also about the anticipation of emotion. So we think about how would we feel if we choose this versus if we choose this other thing. And we also retrieve information from the executive system to see how the different options align with our goals. And what happens in traditional addictions as well is that that decision-making system is compromised. And sometimes it's more difficult for people with addictive disorders to make decisions that are advantageous in the long term. So that's what we know broadly about the different brain systems that are involved in addiction. And there is a certain agreement in the scientific community about that. But then what we want to understand as well is what are the mental processes or what are the cognitive mechanisms that actually make people vulnerable or contribute to the maintenance of an addiction. And that is something that it's not so well agreed in the scientific community. So what we did a couple of years ago is to try to reach a consensus among experts about what are the core components of addictive disorders. So we started with something like 40 different constructs, and we used a technique that it's called Delphi, a Delphi consensus, which consists on repeatedly sampling the opinion of a pool of experts on addiction to try to find out what are the core components that everybody agrees upon as being critical to the vulnerability and the maintenance of addiction. So as I said, we started with something like 40 different ones, and at the end of the process, all the experts agreed that these 7 that I'm showing in the right side of the slide were the ones that were absolutely critical to determine or to contribute. Determining is not the right word, to contribute to the vulnerability and to the maintenance of addiction. So you can see in here that you have quite a few processes related to reward. So you have reward valuation, which is something similar to that incentive salient system that I was mentioning before. And in this case, what happens is that that system becomes a little bit overwhelmed and oversensitized by substance or addictive activities, and that impacts on the way we value other things. But you have other reward-related systems, like, for example, reward expectancy. And this is the tendency, when it goes wrong, is the tendency to miscalculate what is the reward value of something that is about to come up. So you do a little bit of a prediction, and that prediction tends to be wrong. It's either you predict more reward than you actually get, or maybe less reward than you actually get. And the former is much more prevalent in the case of addiction. And you also have issues with reward learning. So this is the ability to learn from the wins and losses that you do in previous decisions and how you incorporate those learnings into subsequent decisions. And then you have also some other cognitive aspects that relate to your ability to select the best action to lead you to the best possible outcome, and also to inhibit those other actions that are not appropriate to the current circumstances. And then you have two other aspects that you have probably heard about quite often, habit and compulsivity. So in psychological terms, habit is a very close connection between a stimulus and a response, such that when that connection is repeated over and over again, it becomes habitual and it's triggered automatically. And compulsivity is when that connection is maintained and therefore the behavior is triggered when the stimulus is present, even when that response is not leading to the original outcome, but is leading to something that is negative for you. So let's say that repeated behavior that is leading to negative consequences is typically defined as something that is compulsive. So in summary, like these 7 different cognitive mechanisms of our mental processes were the ones that the experts considered that were absolutely critical to define vulnerability and maintenance of addiction. And I think in the last couple of slides, what I'm going to try to do is to map those critical components onto some of the key characteristics of the technology-related addictions that you're interested in this webinar. And the first of them is gaming disorder that Mark has been talking about, and is the one that has more scientific evidence or support and has been already recognized by the World Health Organization. But I'm going to spend some time as well talking about problematic social network site use or social media use. And just to mention that there is also literature, emerging literature in other type of online activities like online pornography or binge watching that are under study, but they don't have as much scientific support at the moment. And also to mention that this is versus when people talk about internet or mobile addiction, like in general, the scientific community don't have a lot of agreement about the existence of addictive disorders related to that. That is considered to be the medium, but not the addictive activity. So in terms of gaming, so I've kept the, let's say, the critical cognitive mechanisms in the image on the right side, and then I'm going to comment on some of the aspects of gaming that relate to those cognitive mechanisms. So in terms of reward valuation, obviously, you know that in gaming you have in-game rewards, and those in-game rewards are much more frequent, much more powerful and flashy than what you're used to encountering in normal life, right? And obviously game designers, like, they do a very good job in doing those fantastic 3D animations and making sure that the reward experience is kind of amplified. So one of the potential issues is that reward experience can overwhelm and can overstimulate reward systems in the brain. Then we also have aspects like, for example, monetization, and one of the key aspects of monetization are the loot boxes. So loot boxes are these tokens that people who game buy without actually knowing exactly what's the content. So if you look at what that's doing from a psychological perspective, essentially is enticing and somehow misleading our reward expectancy systems, and therefore is another mechanism by which features of gaming can promote addictive behaviors. We also have aspects of misleading reward learning, and specifically a lot of games use what we call near misses. Probably a lot of you would be familiar with the concept of near miss in the context of gambling. When gambling devices, especially EGM machines, they present the stimuli in a way that it looks like you are about to hit the jackpot, but actually it's just a trick for your reward system, because it has been shown in neuroscientific studies that that type of manipulation stimulates your reward system in a similar way as what an actual game would do. And games also incorporate a lot of these near misses elements that, as I said, is a way of misleading reward learning systems. And also in gaming, there is often, especially in games that are a lot about precision, there is a lot of stimulus response associations, and those stimulus response associations that are the basis of habits, they are not always linked to the desired outcome. So that's another aspect. that contributes to addictive behavior. And then, of course, you have a number of biases and beliefs. Most of them relate to, let's say, exaggerated expectations about the benefits of the online world, which at the same time come at the cost of devaluation of the supposed benefits that you can get in the real world. And obviously that imbalance between those exaggerated expectations around the online world versus the depreciation of the value of the real world can contribute to the time you dedicate to gaming versus the time you dedicate to other adaptive activities. If we now try to adapt the same components to social network use, social media use, in this case, we have the main currency are social rewards, and social rewards are incredibly powerful. And obviously, through social media, you can get them in a much more frequent way and in a much more powerful way in terms of magnitude than what would happen in the real world. So let's say that in the real world, you have to work quite a bit to get a sign of appreciation or a good reinforcement for your behavior. But in social network sites, that comes easier. And that's a powerful stimulator of behavior. You have important aspects of reward expectancy, like, for example, the loading feed. So you've seen that every time you open a social media application, you would see the loading feed icon, which essentially is telling your system that something exciting is going to come up, even though most of the times what comes is quite pedestrian, right? And then you have reward learning elements that are kind of built into the algorithms of these social media platforms in a way that they always feed you with content that you like or you hate. And obviously that is, again, an artificial manipulation of the way you stimulate reward systems in the brain that makes you obviously more vulnerable to habitual behavior that is constantly reinforced. Oh, sorry. And related to that are strong emotions as well, which is another important factor in maintaining online behavior in social media. And you also have some aspects of action selection related to stimulus. That stimulus response association is what people call doom scrolling, sorry, where you're actually constantly refreshing your feed and scrolling on your feed without actually paying attention of whether that is providing any value for you in any way. So those are some of the overall characteristics. In the next few slides, what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you some results of a study that we did in people with excessive social media use. And we were using a very widely used cognitive task of decision making that it's called the Iowa gambling task. So the Iowa gambling task is a computer task in which people have to make a number of choices between different decks of cards. And some of those decks are considered to be disadvantageous because they give you a lot of reward in the short term, but they also give you a lot of punishment or a lot of monetary losses in the long term. So if you consistently choose those ones, you're going to be broke at the end of the game. And on the other hand, you have two other decks that are considered advantageous because they give you little money, but they also take very little money out of you. So if you continue selecting them at the end of the game, you're going to be winning money. And you do that over 100 trials. And the first 40-50 trials are considered to be decision-making under uncertainty, because essentially what you're doing is you're sampling different options and trying to make sense of what they offer you. And then you have the final set of trials in which it is considered to be decision-making under risk, because you already know what the different decks are offering you, but you can make an active choice to continue selecting the risky ones versus the advantageous ones. And we have used this task in a number of studies with people with substance use disorders and gambling disorder. And the consistent finding across studies is that in comparison with people with no addiction problems, these populations tend to have difficulties to change their selections towards the advantageous decks or the decks that are less risky. So essentially the hypothesis that we had in mind is that people with problematic social media use would also have this type of risk-related decision-making pattern in the Iowa gambling task. So what we did is we recruited people through online services, and we were using this Bergen Facebook addiction scale, which is one of the instruments that you can use to try to identify people with problematic use of social media. You can see here that everything is about Facebook, and that has been one of the criticisms to the scale. But actually, it has been shown that this Facebook use is a proxy of more general social media use. So essentially, we were taking people with different levels of problematic social network use. You can see that they had a range between 6 and 27 and an average of 15. So that means that we had some people that were regular users and some people that were more on the severe end of the spectrum, so more problematic users. And this is the learning curve of how they shifted their behavior toward more advantageous or safe choices towards the end of the task. And actually what this shows is that in contrast to what we had found in people with substance use disorders or gambling disorder, people with social media use, they tend to learn in the task. So we don't observe the same degree of problems or the same degree of deficits that we had previously observed in more traditional addictions. But specifically when we looked into the last portion of the task in which people are making what we consider risk-related decisions, so they already know what the different decks have to offer, but they make a conscious decision to go for the safe or for the risky choice. We found that in that segment of the task, there was a significant correlation between more problematic social media use and more risky choices or more risky decision making. In conclusion, what we found in here is that greater problematic social media use was linked to worse performance in a decision-making task. And that kind of performance was in the same direction, but not in the same level of severity that what we had observed previously in people with substance use and gambling disorder. But it appears that people with problematic social media use have a propensity towards risk, and it appears that they weight the potential positive outcomes of their decisions much more than what they weight the negative outcomes of those decisions. And that is something that aligns with that general tendency that we had defined for addictive disorders. And in the last 2 minutes, what I'm going to show you is how we can actually reverse engineer some of the key elements that contribute to reward in the context of gaming, to try to repurpose them to do scientific research and potentially to contribute to positive health outcomes. So what we've been doing is we've been creating an online test of impulsivity. Impulsivity is the tendency to react in a quick and non-planned way without having taking into account the potential consequences of that behavior. And as Mark was highlighting previously, is one of the key characteristics of addictive behavior. And it is also associated with many other physical and mental disorders. So it's one of the main contributors to the burden of disease when you take all the potential contributors together. And therefore, it's a very important construct in psychology and something that we want to measure, and we want to measure well. And what we did in this case is one of the problems that we've had in the past to measure impulsivity is that the cognitive tests that we have used, they didn't undergo a very, let's say, comprehensive psychometric validation process. And one of the reasons for that is that it is often difficult to have access to large sample sizes. That is what you need to do that type of psychometric modeling and to try to validate a proper assessment measure. And in this case, what we did is, okay, we have to try to reach as many people as possible. So we have to try to do something that is engaging, that is attractive, that is rewarding for people, and something that we can do remotely. So without the burden or the extra hurdle of people coming to see us in the lab or in the clinic, something that we can do online and that people can do from their homes or a convenient location at any point in time. So we developed this gamified cognitive test battery of impulsivity, and we did it in collaboration with a game studio. The name is Taurus Games. And what they actually did is incorporating some of the key elements that I mentioned before, like in-game rewards, like attractive and flashy reward experiences, to make sure that we could obtain, let's say, reliable and precise assessments of people impulsive behavior, even though we were not actively supervising them in the lab. They were doing the task from home or a convenient location. And we developed a partnership with Turning Point that manages the national online counseling services. And we embedded this cognitive test battery in the online counseling services so that anybody that was seeking treatment through these services could do the task as a way of self-assessing their impulsivity levels. But at the same time, they were sending us the information to be able to validate this task and see if it was actually a good measure of impulsivity. The advantage of this is that through these features that we introduced in this online gamified task, we were able to access a sample of almost 600 people in a couple of months. So this would normally take something like 10 years to get if you do it through traditional methods. And through that, we could obtain the volume of data that allowed us to validate the task and show that it's a precise and valid measure of impulsivity. And we also showed that through this measurement, we could predict the severity of their addiction problems. So there was a significant association between the cognitive mechanisms that we were measuring through the online task and the severity of their addiction problems. And I guess this is just the first step to try to better identify mechanisms that can contribute to addiction severity, and then being able to develop interventions that can be highly targeted to those mechanisms and can improve the outcomes in people with addiction problems, no matter whether they are traditional addictions or novel technology-related addictions. And actually, at the moment, we are collaborating with people in the UK, in the national NIH gambling and gaming clinics, to try to validate this impulsivity measure in their clients. So I guess what the future brings is we need more research into these cognitive mechanisms that predict the escalation and the development of problems in these so-called technology-related addictions. This knowledge will probably change the conversation and contribute to promote awareness among users, and in the case of pediatric populations, among parents, to be able to establish a good and healthy use of technology, and also will inform policy regulation when needed. And also, as a positive message, we can also leverage the power of technology to reverse engineer for scientific recovery, for scientific discovery and health. Thank you very much to everybody involved and to the funders that make that is possible. Thank you very much for the invitation again, James, and all the attendees.
No worries. Thank you, Antonio. Thanks for your presentation. That's really fascinating. I've got a bunch of questions that I've written down, but we'll save them for the end of the presentation, and hopefully the audience have questions. They'll get first dibs rather than mine. So I'll introduce Mandy Buchholz, who's a program lead on Recoded, which is a pilot program aimed at preventing and reducing harms relating to gaming and gaming dependence among young people, that's operating in Albury in New South Wales.
Good afternoon, everyone. And I'll just do a quick test. You can see the screen okay?
Yep.
Okay. So I'm actually smiling from ear to ear because the work that I've been working on for 2 years has been a lot to do with the work that Antonio and Mark have actually fed into this program, because I had to do a literature review and an evidence-based part of this program. So I'm just ecstatic that I actually am working alongside them on this call today. So yeah, very happy. So I'm Mandy Buchholz, a program lead in a program called Recoded, Changing the Way We Game. And it's an absolute privilege to be obviously talking alongside these speakers. And first and foremost, I just wanted to advise that I'm actually not a video gamer, but there has been some extensive research and strong working relationships with other gamers to build this program. I work using a holistic recovery-oriented lens, and I also focus on reducing mental ill health and promote well-being. So some of the things that we're going to cover today is some key topics, is basically about talking about what my program actually does and what that means, about Recoded's key focus, prevention first. And so with all that great work on addiction, I think this will feed into that work. And my role today was to talk about service delivery and what that looks like within the Recoded scope, as well as I'll share with you some of the things in the work that I've done about what the community has actually said, the consumer voice. And I think I left this in a little square here because I wasn't sure if it was going to be covered or not, but I thought just as a gentle reminder that video gaming industry is basically one of the most profitable businesses in the world, and it's worth more globally than the music and movie industries combined, and it continues to grow. So I focus on working with children and young people, and this gaming industry is a lot bigger than them. So the Recoded's main aim is to offer education through face-to-face sessions, specifically at grade 4 as a preventative measure, and year 8s and 9s, which look at early intervention. We also conduct education sessions to professionals, such as support workers, teachers, parents, and community groups. And a key service support outcome, rather than going through the slide, is basically just to say, we look at protective factors and who's at risk, and then the referral pathways. And we look at awareness around gambling elements within video games and the problematic gaming behaviour. So the program that I'm funded for is really to focus on the gambling elements with games. And I think, as Antonio mentioned before, he talks about the games that can be quite immersive, that have that pokey machine element. And this slide is basically showing you that this is the scope. We look at gambling and those hidden gambling normalizations in games that not everyone knows about. As you can see in this diagram, we don't talk about cyber safety or violence in games, but when I work on a gaming program, a lot of people expect that's what I'm going to talk about, but I think there's so many different elements. And having talked about addiction today, gambling, those hidden elements in these games are very addictive. So the main points of this very busy slide is basically, and I'll send you this pack, is that although Recoded is a prevention program, we also work with children and young people and parents around recognising the signs when gaming starts to become unhealthy and encourage help-seeking behaviour. So we conducted roundtable discussions within the pilot school that I'm working with in Albury, and I was focusing on it really getting the child to understand I wanted to find out if children do know what healthy gaming and unhealthy gaming is, and we can use the term problematic gaming. And they all know, they know what gaming, unhealthy gaming is, whether they're gaming long hours a day and there's nothing else going on in their life. But I think really the key outcome here is raising community awareness of the immersiveness of games. So as part of today, I wanted to discuss what Recoded does around service delivery. And I thought I would just basically share what service delivery actually means. So it is quite obvious, but I thought I'd spell it out anyway. The act of providing a service to customers seems obvious, but despite how big the video gaming environment is, we are not offering a complete holistic approach as yet. Prevention through education, early intervention and harm reduction when problematic gaming exists is where I focus on. And I recently conducted a big webinar called Through the Eyes of a Gamer, and it was quite a good time to actually ask some questions before people signed up to see over the 100 people that came to that webinar, they all had a common theme. And firstly, it was, so those themes were positive gaming is removing this, was about positive gaming. Sorry, I'm getting tongue-tied. And people wanted to know, you know, what does positive gaming look like? And I think this program is about removing the stigma. We're talking about gaming. It is fun, it is entertainment, it is leisure, and it does offer a range of great new skills and autonomy and empowerment, teamwork. There's so many things that we talk about within video gaming. One of the things that I really wanted to talk about was that video gaming is actually a big key in social connection for kids today, for children and young people. And especially during COVID and the pandemic, video gaming was their only outlet to connect with their friends because they weren't going to school. So the next one is how to help young people when gaming seems excessive. And I can include a handout with a list of things to support families around what to do when gaming becomes excessive, because some of the times people would say, well, how do I get my child off a video game? And we've got some strategies around that to support families, because that was such a big part of it. It wasn't so much a concern about the gambling in the games, but it was they're gaming all the time. How do I have this conversation? So we talk about having open conversations, getting them to work with you on setting up boundaries and when's a good cutoff time. We talk about giving them a timer. Someone suggested if they've got a timer, then they can then feel empowered to turn that game off, because gaming is a flow state and it can become quite immersive. So it doesn't necessarily mean that they're able to turn that game off when they've been told. So a timer is actually a tool that can help gamers, young gamers, especially when their brains are so young. And there were some professional services on the call that I recently hosted. And again, just like we're talking about today, it was about signs of harmful gaming behavior, addiction, and early intervention. So they were the four main categories that just came up over at time and time again. And not everyone knew about gambling elements in games. I've actually left the gambling slide that I normally bring up at the start of my presentations, but I've left it at the end because I wasn't sure who was going to talk about it at the start, but I think we can talk about it. I'll run over it right at the end, just quickly. So when a game is switched off and children are removed from the virtual world, remember that they need time to regulate. So I talk about the game and the brain here. As children and young people's brains are not fully developed until they're 25, as I mentioned, this impacts self-regulation, rational thinking, and processing emotions when in a heightened state of gameplay. So remembering that the dopamine release that comes from these games is powerful, and it shuts down that prefrontal region of the brain. And I think one of the things that I like to talk about with families and support services is that, you know, when a game is switched off suddenly, and if they haven't got any other transition to go to, that they do need that cooling off time to settle, because their behavior can become irritable and angry. And if you've got children, then you may have experienced that even just by watching TV, that sudden switch off. They also need time to regulate. And I think some of the parents that I've worked with have said, my child is addicted. That's a sentence that comes up quite a lot in the work that I do, or even working within schools. but I think there's that word addiction is used quite strongly. And given what we've just spoken about earlier with the first two speakers, there's a whole lot of categories around what addiction actually means. If you talk about game and time and how long a child should be playing game, I don't put a time on those things. And the reason why I don't put a time on what is a good time to game is because one child might have been out playing football all afternoon, and then he or she needed to uses the weekend to escape and play games. It's quite a tricky situation that we can't just put a normal answer on that, but it's all about everything in moderation. So when we talk about the addiction side of things and the problematic gaming, some of the things that I talk to, and having worked with loads of experts in this field, to get a good overview of problematic gaming, this is the guide that I've put together. And I've sort of put a little thermostat there to say, when the language starts to become, I need to play, as opposed to I want to play and it's a leisurely thing. If gaming starts to become that need and it's no longer fun anymore, and the anger becomes quite evident over a long period of time, then it might need to be starting to look at what's behind the behavior. So I've put here, if many hours are spent gaming, this does not necessarily mean that they have a gaming addiction. However, it becomes a problem if gaming starts to interfere with daily life, if thoughts, feelings, and behaviors shift. So that sense of hopelessness, where self-efficacy has gone, self-autonomy has been lost, all of those things. So just to really harp on about all the things that we're talking about in terms of addiction, harmful video gaming gambling is not a standalone issue. And I think a lot of you are professional services on this call today. I believe you would agree with that. Harmful gaming or addiction is not the primary problem, but a response to something else. And understanding the reason why a child games is step one to addressing the behaviours. So in the work that I do, I really do focus on always asking the why behind the behaviour. These are some of the descriptions that I thought I would share with you today, just as a quick overview. It's a very wordy slide, but there's things like maladaptive coping strategies. So when a child or a young person is avoiding new situations, is there increased anxiety? Are they missing meals? Are there poor nutrition? Are they gaming behind closed doors? Are they feeling negative emotions? So there's a couple of lists of things there that I won't read out to an nth degree, but just to give, I've actually written something for professional services that has a little checklist of things to look out for. So something that teachers can keep in their back pocket if they're noticing signs, and things like school disengagement as well, which is one of the reasons why, sorry to go back a bit, is why I start working with grade 4s and year 8s and 9s, because grade 4s is that prevention stage and year 8s and 9s is getting in early with early intervention. So good old Maslow's triangle, it's what we all love and use and refer to in the mental health world. But again, I bring it up on this slide pack because it's about looking behind the behaviour and understanding the why. If gameplay is starting to interfere with daily life, let's find out what are those needs that the child is not getting. So looking at the Maslow's and referring to that as a tool. What emotional needs is that gaming feeding? What are they getting in the gaming world that they're not getting outside of the gaming world? Are their parents ignoring them? But they're getting that sense of belonging when they're playing games. So there's nothing wrong with gaming. It's, again, just about understanding if it starts to become problematic, what's happening behind that game. I've actually put in here as well, which I just found this groovy little picture because my one was a bit busy, but the risks and protective factors that come into play with the children and young people as well. So looking at the community, their social and peer supports, their individual character and family factors. So all of those things come into play. If children don't have strong protective factors, then they're likely to be problematic gaming. But also, just to add, gaming is, it doesn't pick and choose. There are elements in there that there are games more addictive than others. And some games have gambling elements in them, some don't. So I won't go into detail about this slide, but it's about the trauma-informed care model that I use when I'm working with schools and support service workers. This basically is an approach that creates that safety. It creates trust, choice, collaboration, and empowerment. So we want to be able to have a conversation where we're not. I remember asking someone a question, "Are you a gamer?" And they were really embarrassed to answer that. It's an amazing thing, and we need to say, "Wow, you're a gamer," just like, "Wow, you're an athlete at school." Children and young people have found something that they're good at, and we should really be embracing that. So if there's something happening and they're gaming and other parts of their life have changed, then let's not call it trauma informed, let's call it strength-based model, where we're actually having a strong and open and community healthy conversation with our children. This is a slide that I put together working with the harm reduction team and with Uniting. What it is I have actually experienced teachers have come across children that kept fleeing the classroom and didn't know what to do, didn't understand why they were running off to the library and video gaming. This was a few cases where I've come across with teachers, but it's not a huge thing. But what I've put together here is some questions that we should be looking at when we're noticing signs and behaviors of problematic gaming. So we could be asking things like, when and why gaming became that prominent activity in a young person's life? What emotional need is that gaming feeding? Has there been any traumatic events that have been happening? Are they being bullied at school? And there's a few questions there, but the one thing that I would love to talk about is, it'd be great if to find out when I'm working with schools is to actually find out what harm minimization approaches they're using when they're working with that child. Are they using a common assessment tool or some sort of wellbeing tool, just to see how they're sitting on the scale? Again, because we don't want to always just focus on the game as the problem, which is what I was hearing very early on in my work. So I talk about some of the services where people can go: Gamble Aware, Headspace, Reach Out. There's information on eSafety. And I know when I was sitting on a mental health foundation summit that they were saying that these services are quite stretched. So this is why I feel looking at prevention and having a whole holistic approach around addiction and problematic gaming, that we start early, we get in with this prevention, we start educating around the knowledge. And this is the next slide that I wanted to go on to, because if we're doing the prevention, the early intervention and the harm reduction, then we're really giving that whole holistic approach. So the prevention being education and noticing those behaviours early, having those open conversations with the child. So there is a gap in harm reduction, especially with what Antonia was mentioning. There's still a lot more work to be done, but we can work with a child where we can do some self-directed recovery, not one size fits all. Let's create a person-centered approach around having motivational interviews, all the things that you would do, which was Mark was saying was very similar to what you would work in AOD. And yeah, having a look at what's going to best fit for the individual of the child. So Recoded works around all of the prevention and early intervention, and harm reduction is still not something that is in my scope, but I'm still very intrigued by it and wondering how we can move it forward to communicate this with consumers. Where can they go? These are some of the tools that I can share with you afterwards, and it's just a letter that I put together, or a handout, I should say, for families, little strategies to help at home. And I've put together a little harmful signs and behaviour prompting tool just to have if anyone's after it. And I think a couple of things to end on is video gaming is here to stay. The industry growth is rapid, and gaming is a community for many and a sense of belonging, which I've mentioned a few times, but it is so important to mention. A large reason why kids game is due to that behavioural desire to connect. It's part of their development. Healthy social connection is vital for a child's development. And let's all remind ourselves, if you're a parent, then gaming is also the path of least resistance. Gaming has made the perfect babysitter, I know, for me in my world, and probably for some of the parents that are on the call today. So as parents and carers and professionals, we need to understand the gaming world, notice the signs and get in early. It's also not the responsibility of the child, which have been asked before, to actually have that cognitive ability to actually get off that game. We should be setting up those tools and having those boundary setting conversations with the child. Now, I was going to end there, but because we didn't touch on the video gaming, I'll just show you this one last slide. And the key focus is I do bring in the casino element of gambling in games, but when I was speaking to some gamers, it wasn't so evident with young people and children. So the two things that I wanted to quickly bring up, if you're not aware of it, is the loot boxes. I know it was mentioned earlier, but I'll just say, what's a loot box? Well, a loot box is like a big flashing pokie machine. It offers that reward mechanism that was mentioned before. It's got that anticipation. What's inside the box? Think of a Kinder Surprise, or think of those machines where all those children and young people are paying to get that teddy out of the slot machine, and the likelihood of that happening is quite slim. And I think that's a real good analogy when children want to spend money on these loot boxes. And I know that when I ask the video gamers, how do they get around using these loot boxes? It can actually be quite a trap. So having conversations with your children and young people about loot boxes. Skin betting is another form of gambling, not so much in the younger children, but there are studies out there that talk about children as young as 11 are skin betting. There is a percentage, and it's basically what is the skin in a video game? It's like a change in your appearance. It doesn't enhance your play at all. And like I said, there are some other games that gambling is not actually involved in. So it's about having those conversations and finding out what your child is playing. I've just put in some words that we use across the industry is simulation, which is gambling in games, anything that's chance and reward, and slotification, which is those casino games that are free to play. And then later on down the line, they're asking for you to pay money. And loot boxes are obviously known as micro transactions, which Mark mentioned before. I'll actually, I don't know how long I've been going for. I haven't kept a track of time, but I can send these slides because I know you've already had a lot of information already, but I'll just say that I talk about the crossover of gambling and video games in this slide. I talk about some of the stats that you might be interested in, what the studies have been saying. Mark's probably been involved in some of these stats around the gambling inside games and those impacts. And I don't need to bring up this because this is what Mark had actually already brought up, was the DSM-5. So I'm obviously ticking that box, and I'm doing what the work, following on from the work that he's bringing forward. So that's it from me. And these are just approaches that I'll leave in the pack for those that are looking at things in a holistic lens. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Mandy. So just to answer the question that a couple of people have said, Mandy will make those resources in the checklist available after the webinar. I will figure out how to do that. I assume Mandy will send them to me, or I'll send around a link to all the participants to make sure everyone can get their hands on those. So thank you for that, Mandy. We might go to some of the questions that came through. Let's see. So Antonio, I wasn't sure if you could answer. There's a couple that you might be able to answer, but it's also no worries if you can't. One question was if there was any data or evidence around a link between autism spectrum disorder and being comorbid with gaming or gaming harm or addiction?
Yeah, actually, I saw the question in the chat, and I was doing satellite searches online. So I guess the simple answer is, based on my very quick reading of the literature, is that there is not enough literature, and that's probably associated with the fact that we are just starting to estimate the prevalence of gaming disorder, and there are a few problems in the reliability and validity of those assessments, as Mark was also pointing at. So I think at this stage it's very premature to talk about any reliable estimate of what would be the comorbidity with other type of disorders. Sorry that maybe the response is a little bit disappointing, but I think it's a reflection of the current status.
Yeah, and one thing that I guess that made me think about, especially the follow-up question, which was about, kind of broader neurodivergence and comorbidity, is that often in AOD and with other issues like, whether it's homelessness and housing instability, or poor social outcomes, all sorts of things. Often those harms can stack with certain groups of people, or certain groups of people that are at risk of one become increasingly at risk of additional ones. And then you can get some cases where, someone's experiencing really complex forms of 3, 4, 5 comorbidities, and it's not necessarily that they're causing one another, or the relationship between them is just very difficult to understand, but they can all occur together.
That's right, and I think that comes back to a point that Mandy has done very eloquently, that is, let's try to understand when gaming is excessive, what are the motivations behind it? And oftentimes you don't need to put labels on that. It's more about like really getting close to the phenomenology and understanding what is happening and how we can help with some of those needs that are at the moment like canalized through the gaming behavior.
Yeah, thanks, Antonio. Mandy, we did have another question that said, when you say gambling, does this include microtransactions for skins and accessories?
Yes, and I sort of skimmed over it quickly because I wanted to focus on service delivery, but I think with the skin betting elements, that's not obvious to parents. It's on a separate gaming world, like the underworld web, or however. I think Antonio's probably got better language than me around it, even though I normally rely on the gamers I work with to talk about it because I'm not a gamer. But yes, there is betting within skin. I mentioned what a skin was. It's around that costume or that avatar, or however you enhance your look, like buying a pair of Nike runners. I think skin betting is really, it's evident, it's real, and there are people actually betting on bigger guns or better shoes. I don't know. I'm not a gamer, but it is happening.
So I didn't know about skin betting. I know about skins, which are like, an aesthetic change to your avatar, which you can, I guess, purchase for a small amount of money. But if you purchase hundreds of them, it all adds up. But I'd never heard of skin betting. So that's like on a sort of different website where you will bet for skins, I suppose.
No, we're all speaking in this language, but it is. Look, this is why I talk about parents getting involved in what your children and young people are doing, because they may not understand that it can become quite immersive with this skin betting, and having those conversations. Do you really need this? But again, they may want it, and we should be respecting that and listening to them as why. Yes, they want to have a different Nike shoe. I say Nike because I'm wearing Nikes today and I keep looking down at my shoe. But, so we need to give them a voice in that, but just being aware, are they betting on it and what's happening?
Yeah. Does anyone else have any questions? I have a couple that I'm intrigued by. So someone said that their clinical experience would suggest a link with autism spectrum disorder, but that it's that's a tricky thing. I think, we need those big, really multiple big established studies to really, determine those kind of the links and a difference, but a difference between, as we said, something just co-occurring and something kind of a contributing or mutually constitutive relationship or something like that.
I do get a
right.
lot of questions about that. Sorry,
Yeah,
I didn't, but that comes up a lot in my work, and I kind of have to brush it down because I don't know the answer, and I feel terrible, but it's obviously a need there.
Yeah, but you're right, James. I think the gold standard to try to estimate that would be a population-based study with sensitive and specific tools to diagnose both gaming disorder and autism spectrum disorders or ADHD, different neurodevelopmental disorders that we're interested in. And I mean, to the best of my knowledge, that is not yet there. So I think we have to be cautious for the moment. I think people with autism spectrum disorders, a lot of them have a natural inclination for technology. So that could be part of their interest. But I think we cannot make the inference that put them at higher risk of developing a gaming disorder. I think that still needs to be established.
Yeah, thanks, Antonio. One thing I thought about, Mandy, was I saw in one of your slides the words unconditional positive regard, and I'm familiar with that phrase, but I thought it'd be great if you could say a little bit more about what that is.
Look, I think putting that simple, everyone deserves to be treated with unconditional positive regard, and that's a service, strength-based principle that I take on with everything I do, just not with just consumers, but with everybody. And I think really it comes down to not judging a person for their choices, and everyone's making the best choice in the situation that they've got. And we should always work with someone, even if it's your own child, with that open and encouraging and listening relationship with anyone, and hearing someone's story. Everyone's on their own journey, and it's not just about the gaming world. I think this should be happening everywhere. Don't you think the world would be a better place if it was all unconditional positive regard?
Yeah, thank you. And just one thing I wanted to follow up with: some of the kids that you work with, do you get a sense that they feel like maybe the adults in their lives misunderstand their gaming or judge them for their gaming? Do you think?
Such a brilliant question, James, because one of the guys that I work with is from Alana Madeline Foundation, and he actually has built, and I'd love to share it with you because it's such a good piece of work, but he works with young people to get their voice. These are gamers, and they work with how they can best talk to their parents so that their parents can understand more about their world and what they're living and breathing.
Yeah, so, that's great. Yeah. All right, we've got another from Simon. Are there established links between eating disorders, a lack of exercise, connected to long periods of gaming? Antonio, do you know the?
I think by definition, so when gaming is excessive, it occurs at the cost of other activities, right? And that is something that Mandy was highlighting as well, and I think it's a very important point. So one of the warning signs that gaming behavior is becoming problematic is if the person is losing a little bit of touch with other daily activities, and that includes proper sleep, proper nutritional habits, proper exercise, and contact with peers. So naturally, there's going to be a connection between excessive gaming and a reduction of these meaningful activities. And I think that's what we have to keep an eye on. In terms of established links as of shared prevalence or comorbidities, I refer to my previous answer. I think like we don't still have the evidence to be conclusive about that.
Sorry, I just muted myself. All right, thanks, Antonio.
Can I actually add something about the exercise there?
Yeah, please, Mandy.
Very quickly. It was Daniel Donahue who wrote Gamers by gamers, which I just mentioned his name because he's done such great work, but I actually don't have this in my flyer. So I would like to just mention that I had a wellbeing resilience coach on one of my calls who talked about, if you're working with children, 1 hour of gaming should equal 1 hour of exercise. And if you're saying you don't have time for exercise, he basically said, well, then have time for illness. So I thought that was quite a good thing that I heard, and I wanted to share it.
Thanks, Mandy. Okay, well, we might leave it there. We're at time. So thanks so much, everyone, for joining us at the webinar today. Thanks to Mark, who's hopefully asleep now, Antonio and Mandy for their contribution today. And I'll be sending follow-up emails with a link to the recording, any other resources that the resources that Mandy mentioned. And yeah, thanks very much, everyone.
Thank
It was
you.
great being here.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.